Well, Claire, Ory, I'd like to thank you both for joining me today. And we've been spending a lot of time looking at Washington, and it's quite interesting to hear about the criticisms and the critiques and the lack of transparency. But I think in many ways, Washington is nirvana compared to many different parts of the world. So what we'll be doing today between the three of us, just exploring the fabric of peace, the fabric of conflict, and trying to do it in an international setting. But I think from my own perspective, one of the profound realisations of my life was just how little we actually know about many of the things which we consider most important in our lives, such as peace. 5 years ago, I was wandering through Africa and was in the Congo, and I started to wonder what the most peaceful nations in the world were like. Did some searching on the internet, asked some friends and couldn't find anything. So from there I launched a product called the Global Peace Index, which today is the world's leading study of the peacefulness of nations in the world. But something profound I realised out of that. If a simple businessman like myself could be wandering through Africa and start to wonder what are the most peaceful nations in the world are like, then what do we know about peace? Similarly, if you went into any the major universities in the world and you went into the literature departments, you're not going to find a course on the literature of peace. Yet everyone in this room would know some profound works. Similarly, if you went into any of the major universities anywhere in the world, you're not actually going to find a chair in peace economics. Yet most businessmen believe the size of their markets increase with peace and their costs reduce. So we've done the Global Peace Index. We've then done a whole lot of statistical analysis to be able to work out a fact-based approach to what actually creates peace. And none of it's counterintuitive. So it's things like well-functioning government, strong business environment, the equitable distribution of the resources through society, and underpinning those three structures, things like a free flow of information, which is epitomised by a free press. It is things like high participation rates in education, low levels of corruption, and good relationships with neighbouring states. So as we start to look at this now, it's like how can I put it? It all binds together as a mix. It's a bit like a brick wall. If you pull one brick out of a brick wall, you've probably got 80% of the structure or the strength of the structure still left. And peace, in many ways, works like that. Now, I might actually just, having given a bit of background on the work we've done there, might just pass it over to Claire, actually, and ask her experiences from Afghanistan and what she's experienced and what actually creates for effective states.
Certainly. I had the immense privilege but responsibility to be part of the team that went to Afghanistan in 2001. And a group of us stood in the rubble and understood, because most of the citizens of the country told us, that the key problem was how to establish a legitimate order, a system that people could trust. We called the World Bank, the State Department, the UN, the IMF, and said, what are the functions of the state? What do states do? How do we build an accountability system, a health system, education system? They said, we don't know. They didn't have any guidebooks. And so the group of Afghans had to figure it out from first principles. There were many successes and many failures, and by 2005 they left because an agenda of system building wasn't backed. And my colleagues and I then took a step back to ask the question, what is the role of the state in the 21st century? And what's the balance between state and market and civil society? And where we learned most of our lessons was looking at the states that have transformed successfully over the last 20 to 30 years. We can't look back 300 or 400 years because the people who did it aren't with us anymore, but it's looking at Singapore, Spain, Rwanda, Mozambique, Botswana, Chile, have incredible lessons of how systems and how legitimate orders were created. My colleague Ashraf Ghani and I have put out a framework and say, here are the 10 functions that states should provide in the 21st century. It could be 8, it could be 12. But what we think is that in any particular context, you have to agree on a framework. There has to be a common understanding, and then you can measure it. And this functional framework includes the monopoly on the means of violence, so an army and a police force. It includes an accountable public finance system, a health system and an education system, regulation of the market. Not that it should be all performed at the central level, it's a question of at what level should each function be performed. And the experience, coming back to Afghanistan, one of the things that really worked was actually radical decentralization, giving the village the resources and the decision-making power and the tools of accountability to make the system work. Very simply, a block grant was given to each of 28,000 villages. The villages elect their village council, make their own budgets, implement their projects, and then put accounts up in a public place. The system is now in 28,000 villages. And the villagers have now come to the capital and said, look, we know how to run our villages. Why don't you know how to run the country?
Oh, thanks for that, Claire. Probably about 2, maybe 3 years ago, I was in Kenya. I'd say working in the slums in Nairobi. And at that stage, it was 2 weeks before the elections there. And I was absolutely amazed at how invigorated everyone was by this up-and-coming election. You'd see groups of 10, 20 people at a time vigorously discussing politics. And I remember walking away from that trip and wondering and just thinking, gee, I wish in the West we were actually that engaged in the politics. 2 weeks later, they had the election. The election was a knife edge, and then it erupted in violence. But I watched the progress of it, and seeing I'd just been there, I was really very, very interested. It was interesting to watch how the Kenyans themselves actually came together to solve their problem. And Ory was one of the people he really, truly engaged right in the middle of the action. So I was just wondering, what lessons have you learned about making states work out of your experiences with the Kenyan election?
Thanks. I don't know whether I can speak in a broader sense of what makes states work, but I think in the Kenya context, a number of things stood out immediately. As you pointed out, we were very engaged in the pre-election period, very vibrant, very free press. Nobody really anticipated the violence happening. But one of the reasons it was possible for it to translate into a life and death situation was a lack of trust in the institutions. So unlike a Bush versus Gore case where there's a flawed result, but then you trust the Supreme Court to settle it and you live by that rule. So the absence of institutions that you can trust, and which is one of the key things we've been pushing with the new constitution, is not just about peace building, but also building institutions that allow citizens to vent and feel that there is a recourse. I think it's also important. This was not the first time that there's been violence in Kenya around elections. It was just on a bigger and much more catastrophic scale. But there's been no justice in the previous cases of violence in 92 and 97. And even now in 2007, a lot of the perpetrators have still not been prosecuted. So the role of justice and impunity. And then the third thing was that as citizens, we realized, my gosh, if we leave this business to politicians alone, we will fall apart. And so there was this big push by citizens to engage in the process, not just around ending the violence, but making sure that what was negotiated as a settlement was not just a negotiated settlement between politicians, but that involves the roles that Kenyans will play, and that they stick to that agenda, and that we also have a responsibility to watch our politicians and our government and make sure that they're living up to the promises. So accountability is not just about government being open, that as citizens, part of being a citizen is not just voting, but watching the process after you vote.
Thanks, Ory. One of the other things too, I think, in the West, we're all motivated by money. Money, and certainly for me, a background in business, money's always been very, very important, one of the major measures of success. But if we look at peace, what's the relationship between peace and money? So we did a study with the UN Global Compact, and they interviewed all their C-level executives. 80% of them actually believed that their markets expanded as you increase peace. 79% of them thought that their costs actually reduced as you increase peace. So on the back of that, we did some study with some world-renowned economists to actually price the cost of peace to the global economy. And we did it over a 4-year period, and the figure came out at an unbelievable $28 trillion. So that's about $7 trillion per annum, and that's really big money. But we're never actually going to get a world which is basically peaceful, but we could imagine a 25% reduction in violence globally. And that had come to about $1.75 trillion. And just to give you an idea of what that actually means, we could, for $500 billion, pay off Greece's debt. The 2020 targets for carbon emissions with the EU, you can fund that for $48 billion. And you could take all the Millennium Development Goals and you could fund them for another $100 billion a year. And that still leaves you a good $1 billion left over for economic stimuluses, or I guess you could have a global party if you wanted to. So with peace, there's a profound amount of wealth which can get unleashed. Now, the US, for example, it's 83 on the Global Peace Index, which is a fair way down. If you could actually reduce violence in the US by 25%, that would probably be enough to actually fund your unemployment problem. Now, I'll pass it over to Clare at this point because we are running out of time. I've only got about 5 minutes left. And I know Clare has got some very strong views on business in Afghanistan.
Well, and in many other countries, I think often we look at the countries towards the bottom of the Human Development Index, the supposedly poorest countries in the world. But if we look again, we realize they have incredible latent wealth and resources. Southern Sudan, for example, Sudan has the capability to put water back in the Nile and become the breadbasket of the region. Afghanistan famously has rediscovered, they knew this 1,000 years ago, more than probably $3 trillion worth of mineral resources. But the question is getting the accountability and governance frameworks right to realize that wealth. If we look again at these countries that did transform successfully over the last 3 decades, what did they do? They got their leadership right, they got a system of accountability right, and they invested in jobs and skills. And for those of us who travel a lot around the world, whether you're in southern Sudan or in the mountains of Nepal or in the southern areas, in the Pashtun areas, which are right now the heart of the insurgency in Afghanistan, teenagers come up to you and say, where do I get a job? Where do I get a skill? So how do we really radically change our approach to investment and realizing the latent wealth in the society rather than investing in repressive approaches?
Interesting, very interesting, yeah. And if we come back to Kenya, Ory, it'd be real, because if we look at business, like really good business environments, a function with strong levels of transparency. So, and I know you've got some very strong views on Kenya and transparency. Could you just talk a little bit about business, government and transparency in Kenya, and what, if you could get it right, you'd do, and what would be the outcomes?
Sure, and if I can just pick on a thread that Clare brought up and maybe expand on it a little bit, not just in Kenya but in Africa as a whole. I think one of our challenges is sort of the resource curse, right? So DRC would probably be very peaceful if it had no resources at all. And so there's the challenge then, if we're talking about business, the biggest driver of conflict in DRC at the moment is probably business. So how do you how do you balance the two? But I think also the point that you brought, the dividends of peace, I think we've seen in Kenya, you know, sort of the economy was in the tank after the violence, the reputation, and all the progress we had made to date as far as the development and the potential, the violence. We're sort of having to start from scratch as far as branding ourselves, which, you know, in Africa, it's hard enough as it is to change perceptions of what the potential is. So there's a strong business imperative, and I think one of the things business realized in Kenya, again, is that they cannot afford to disengage. They cannot afford to be not part of the governance discussion. So they were very involved in the peace negotiations. They've been very involved in the, you know, in the settlements and tracking, and realizing that this actually sort of has an impact on your bottom line, whether the country falls apart or not. But having them being part of the table has been really important. I think the other thing I really feel strongly about is something that we see, this idea of we want our government to do this, and we want our government to build roads, and we want our government to build schools, and why isn't our government doing this? And this sort of infantilizes the citizenry. And it's not just in Kenya, I think it's everywhere. I'm just amazed at how much invective Obama is getting here in terms of, why don't you do this and why haven't you fixed that? And I'm like, so where's his support base? Where are people helping him, get his messaging out? And the idea that government is the solver of all problems, I think is a dangerous one and something I'd like to see us get away from. And it's not just about government being transparent. It's, again, going back to the idea of you as a citizen, what role can you play in holding government accountable? How can you engage? How can you be aware of what your politician is doing? And some of the work we're trying to do with tools like Ushahdi and Mzalendo is not just transparency for the sake of it, but also saying, help us keep a watch on these guys. And sometimes they are doing good work, and I think it's important to recognize the politicians and the government officials who are doing good work and sort of to professionalize that. You've used Singapore as an example, and so that we're not always just trashing institutions, but helping them build and improve.
Yeah, I think they're excellent comments. Well, I'm reading here that time is up, so Claire, I'd like to thank you for your comments. They were excellent, and Ory, it was great to get some insight into Africa. So thank you very much.
Meet Claire and Ory.